a bit of some understanding about moss, so I sympathize with the interest in this small species that looks so irrelevant, but is actually pervasive and really of great importance. And there's so many different types of mosses, obviously. But the question I was having, in particular in regards to these final maps that you're suggesting, which I find really interesting, by the way. I didn't exactly understand how they were recreated, how the London map was recreated, but it has to do with the issue of scale. And that is that you are operating on two very different scales simultaneously. So on the one hand, you have the voxels with moss that operates on a very small scale, on a scale not only of the species, which is small, but also on a voxel that then has a building scale for a facade. Yes. And then at the same time, you're working on a very large scale where an entire cityscape is being changed. And one of the arguments we made when we started working with mosses and bioreceptive walls was to say that a lot of greening in cities was based on strategies to implement green areas with trees and big lawns in cities. So greening meant visual greening, something that people can see, and politicians made sort of a big case to say, oh, a city is much greener now, because it was really about square meters and volume of trees. Now, when you deal with mosses and cryptogams, which are these tiny species, algae as well, lichens, etc., they're so small you can't really quantify them very easily. They don't create the volumes in the square meters that politicians like to address, but they play a very important role. Now, what they don't do is they don't change the map in the way you showed, because they don't have that volume presence. They don't have the lawn presence of the green, of the grass taking over areas. They are very hidden. They're in parts of the year, like for instance now, where it's fairly dry, you hardly see them at all. They sort of nearly disappear everywhere. But once it rains, and London is a great place because, as you might remember, during the winter period where it rained a lot, the entire city is absolutely covered with algae and moss. Everything, it becomes biocolonized basically because there's so much moisture. So what my question is sort of in terms of the strategies, I like both. I would call them projects. It's almost that you have parallel investigations here on a very large scale and on the smaller scale with a voxel. The way they relate for me is currently still a bit in the air because they operate on so different scales, especially because in periods of the year, the mosses you're talking about literally vanish and they become inactive. And the whole energy process probably doesn't work unless you have enormous amounts of irrigation that helps it to work. And then certain types of mosses, I don't know if the one that you chose, actually don't like to be irrigated all the time. So only certain groups of mosses like to be irrigated. The other ones actually need the dry period. But then, as I said, the large scale operates on other scales of plants somehow. And I wonder how you're going to bring this together, how the vanishing and apparent aspect of mosses is actually something that appears, because it appears then everywhere. It's not only on your map, it's literally everywhere where they find a surface. So I think this is currently for me a very interesting topic, because it is actually really interesting to know how to make a case on a larger scale about species that are so small. It's difficult. It's not easy to map it. It's not easy to sell it, not easy to make it visible. But I think your project is touching this very important points of the larger scale impact and the smaller scale, and how this correlation. By the way, I think your facade idea with the voxel system could be really interesting. I actually think there's a lot of potential with the points of how this could create these singular elements that have their own energy source and then conjointly create a big sort of, it's nice that you're flipping through the images. Yeah, this here, I think this is actually has a lot of potential. And it's also easy to replace when single elements don't work, you can replace them. So actually in terms of maintenance, it has a practicality that is really interesting. And I think the maps that this creates, it's three-dimensional topologies are amazing, are really fascinating with most, but bear in mind again, they will disappear, not physically, but they become inactive for large periods of the year. They're just simply as if they're not there. And then you think this, you just have a dry wall, which works with its morphology. You know? But interesting, very, very interesting. I don't know if you want to respond to this scale jump into the grand maps, how you thought to do this.
So like we have a intermediate scale as well. There is like we introduce that's this thing which we are gonna explore in the next attempt, in our next phase. So we have a building part which we call it as a bryostructura. So like after we got this like novel morphology, we are trying to extract the volume and then like implement these voxels into the build form. So that's our next stage of the project.
But isn't this what we are looking at in a way, the beginning of this build form? I'm reading these ones as a set of potential facades. Isn't it what this is?
These were like on the existing volumes, like we chose a building which was existing in the current city, and then we kind of transformed into a new morphology. But after the machine learning part, we are trying to interpret the new morphology of the city in form of a newer build form, not just a building, but not just as a facade, but as a complete building which is made out of this voxels.
You know, the thing you should take in account when you redesign your urban map is the orientation. Because one thing we do know is that north and northwest are the two areas where moss will grow mostly and for the longest periods of time. So maybe instead of being something that is driven algorithmically in sort of all sorts of directions, maybe what you need to do is actually do really an analysis of how building facades that are having these type of orientations will have or will promote a set of growth systems. So it's the north oriented city type of algorithm, when north really starts playing a role of changing the map. Because we usually like to neglect the north facades because we see them as traditionally as cold and damp. But from your point of view, they're really, really interesting. The city of the north facing facades is the one that you really want to promote and engage with. And I think that is fascinating, actually, because then the park is not just growing sort of in all sorts of directions. It's actually growing according to always these certain orientations that the backs or the fronts of buildings have, and the areas and streets, etc. So there's an urban morphology that then becomes driven by shade rather than just going topographically in all sorts of directions or because of whatever other reason you find, which I think is exciting, is actually really, really, really interesting. In fact, I remember Stephen Gage once made a comment that in the Victorian period, and actually before, in English architecture, north-facing facades were considered by the inverse logic, which is they usually were considered very much through the interior. And that is the big windows, the big beautiful rooms had a north-facing orientation because it was through those windows that you could look at the south facades of the buildings that you were looking at. And I thought, actually, this makes a lot of sense. It's not that you want the rooms all being on the north facing facade. What you want is to look at what gets all the light. And it's a visual conversation, which is interesting. You see, it creates really a relationship of exposure, because ultimately it has to do with drought, desiccation phenomena that really play a very important role. And I tell you, we did tests here in London and we thought, oh, you know, London has a lot of rain. We figured out that London doesn't have sufficient rain at all. And it's not only climate change. Now it's worse, but it doesn't have sufficient rainfall to sustain moss walls all the way through. Absolutely not. they dry out for large chunks of the year if they are not fully irrigated and maintained in a different manner, which they could obviously, but yeah.
This is very inspiring, Marcus, with this whole kind of idea of north facades. It's a really interesting idea. And I was also thinking when I was looking at your presentation that this idea of maybe rendering invisible visible and going from this extremely micro to extremely macro conditions that you are trying to span is very interesting. And I must commend you for exquisite, beautiful drawings, which we are used to in Claudia and Marcus Studios, but really these ones are fantastic. Except that sometimes it's not quite clear how you make a jump from one layer of data or information to another. And I would like to see, because you were mentioning lots of interesting things. I mean, Mossen is fascinating, especially now when Marcus brought up all these ideas of shading and north facades. So it's a really interesting topic. But also you were mentioning pollutants and oxygen and things like that. And it would be great to see rendering this kind of invisible forces visible. So how, I mean, maps of oxygen and moss and things like that. So it would be really great to see more details on that. And then also architecture is this kind of middle scale that you are maybe engaging somewhat less than micro and macro. Oh, I have an echo. I don't know why. So anyways, at some point you started developing this kind of voxelized polyscalar sequences. And it could be interesting in the context of distributed energy production, distributed systems that are not centralized, that are not dependent on large infrastructures. Marcus also mentioned this idea of being able to substitute, replace local failures or local conditions. So that I find very interesting. So in a way, the host building that you started with, which is just a block, generic block building, I'm not sure it's doing you too much favor at the moment, because then you start translating this one map into another, and then you come to this image that is at the moment on the screen, which to me doesn't make too much sense. Facades make sense in that kind of building, but what's happening inside, it's not clear what that is and how, for instance, moss or some other biological species would populate that area inside of the building. But some of your voxelized systems are eroding this kind of volume of a building and creating more exposure, for instance, to the sun or to the shade, depends how you work with them, and more surface area, etc., where you can actually potentially populate or multiply populations of this species. So I think it would be interesting to maybe in the time that is left really look at the morphology of architecture that sits in the middle of these larger fields. Just one quick point. Still to finish, it was not clear to me how you're using AI apart from this latest sequences, but you were mentioning some sort of, for instance, the larger scale voxels. You were saying this is humans and AI. It was a little bit unclear how you're treating different agencies and what is the role of AIs in your building and how that works. That wasn't clear earlier in your presentation.
Yeah, in the point in which you work with the catalytic cell. Catherine, maybe you want to clarify that?
Yeah.
So what we are like taking the biointelligence. So if we are taking this portion, for instance, we're using the different aspects of the biointelligence, like moss, what it is, like really changing the let's say for the oxygen or the how it creates production of oxygen or carbon dioxide, or how it creates energy. So we're trying to use that aspect in a form of this box, which we're terming it as a voxel, which will be later on implemented in these manners, like these contain many voxels. If you see the morphology in this, they're containing many of these morphologies together, and then that's how we're saying that this is breathing in, and out of like how a moss will, as a plant will breathe in, and then creating this morphology.
Yeah, there is a point that I think you should probably clarify if for the part of the material system, what you are, the intelligent cell, what are they reading and how they are reacting and how do they participate to the gardening, because at the moment that is effectively probably not very clear. That there is a point on that. Is some
Like
of the,
these
yeah,
portions?
you have voxel that are about cultivation, unit that are about cultivation, and unit that are about recording and participation to the cultivation. So which kind of data they are reading and how they are reading them maybe is not very clear at the moment, and it could be probably developed further.
Yes, like based on how right now we're just telling that these are the apparatus which is measuring the carbon or the pollution levels and so on, and how much it will improve with the MOS implementation voxels. But later, as we develop this further, we can actually give a clarified like how the biostructure as a whole is contributing and all this factor and bringing those, let's say, pollution levels down.
Personally, I think that this slide is very important, and you don't necessarily make a good use of it in your narrative, because I think that beside being a kind of a interesting experiment in itself, I think also conceptually it provides the link between, let's say, the biological narrative and what we may call the infrastructural narrative. Like the moment in which your plants as a living system connects with your informational system, let's say, the one that you use to, on one side, monitor, extract data from the atmosphere, for instance, the urban microclimates, and on the other end, let's say, feed that back into the behavior and the response that the living organism has to this microclimate, right? So for me, that's where the kind of crucial feedback loop of information occurs. And sorry, something is kind of bouncing back.
Yeah, there is some.
Maybe somebody needs to mute itself. Can you just make sure everyone is mute if he's not speaking now? Thank you. So yeah, I was just saying, so for me, this also becomes the kind of link, the sort of missing link in the narrative right now, or maybe the link that should be clarified between the let's say, the scale, the micro scale, and the macro scale of the city, of the urban environment. I think Marcos was pointing out one of the key issues, if you want, of the sort of regreening ideology, that sort of always happens at this kind of macro level, is through large trees or lawns, etc. Now, what you are doing here, it's connecting something that is micro to a macro problem, which is effectively air pollution, if you want. And so I guess the key, let's say, to sell your pitch, if we want to use a business-driven language, or the key to for me, clarify one potential narrative of your project is to essentially consider the urban microclimate and the kind of pollution as one of these urban layers that you are directly engaging with. And so in that sense, this pixel or voxel, this unit, is the way you could actually materially, but also in terms of resolution and scale and quantities, connect these two phenomena, right? And so begin to understand the kind of final images that you are showing as scenarios in which you try to, for instance, neutralize a certain amount of pollutants per unit of surface or per unit volume. And so it becomes on one side very much a kind of numerical exercise, but of course the way you have set it up, it is also has a kind of clear morphological output, which is kind of your generative engine. And so in that sense, the invisible becomes very visible, and also kind of questions, you know, kind of assumptions that we now have of what should be a kind of regreening logic, and you know, how do we understand the kind of refunctionalization of cities in terms of neutralizing, for instance, pollutants. No? So I think for me that's the key element, and I agree that the moment in the middle of the presentation where you illustrate this kind of a typical building sections through, I found that the most difficult to understand. I think, first of all, I think it was too long, and also it is not clear what is going on there. Maybe that's a part that you can perhaps even, you know, sharpen. I know perhaps there's a lot of work there, but I think maybe that's a part in which you could actually simplify in your presentation, sharpen, and just use it really as a kind of connecting element in this bigger narrative, rather than, you know, going so much in detail in a way that is not necessarily supporting the narrative of the project.
Thank you. Other comment?
Yeah, maybe I could say that I find it very interesting. I have too the perception of this change of scale that is very challenging. Maybe a suggestion that is another aspect that could be taken into consideration to link these very different scales could be also energy, because I think I saw from one of the first panels that there was also this idea to connect it with the photovoltaic somewhere. I think I got it in one of the first data analysis at the beginning, because this could be, energy could be a sort of boundary that can collect the system, the middle scale of architecture, and then the city. How MOS can help in understanding the data of the environment, so pollutants and making photosynthesis and CO2, challenging the CO2 emission, but also if it can work to, of course, it would be not a lot of energy, but if you scale it up, it could be that the energy he is making can help the building, can help the city, and can become, as the drawings I saw from the beginning, I took some notes, this idea of dots, lines, space, volume. So also if you are a dot, you need energy somehow. No, it's the first part that allows your environment to change. You know, every time there's a change, there's energy involved. So how can you control the entropy, let's say, from the biological system to the city? I think maybe this could be a suggestion also, not to go too deep on it, but as you are already collecting a lot of data, as you are already thinking as this multi-scale, probably it could be a line that can help you to reconnect the different scales that are very tough. Of course, I think it's the point, not to reconnect all this scale, but of course you have to lose and gain something every time you scale up, the more you scale up. So maybe this could be a suggestion to take into consideration.
Yeah, this is something we were looking at, especially when we went from the scale of the facade to the scale of the overall city. So in that case, the transition was the idea not to work on a facade of retrofitting a building, also because we discovered that many of these buildings that the students were looking at are effectively former council buildings that are not structurally sounded and probably will be demolished, but rethink the landscape of production in East London as something that can be reconstructed in a more integral manner. And so that's the step the students were working at the moment on. That's why I think also this passage of scale at the moment is not clear, because I think the work on the building itself and the retrofitting will be superseded. And there will be a proposal that look at how more integrally the whole landscape can be transformed. Thank you. Are there other?
Can I just, Claudia, can I make a quick comment of something that maybe is helpful also for the group to progress? When I look at this image that is on the screen right now, which again, I agree with Marco, is a very pivotal one. It does, however, imply a big contradiction in the work that might be used now creatively and constructively to change a few things. And that is that the larger scale simulations have suggested a certain sort of growth branching quality, where there is a level of unpredictability of what growth implies that you play with, that you are using in the strategies on a larger scale. Yet when you get onto this small scale of the machinic, you're basically giving moss a tiny square to grow in. Now, this is a contradiction because this is something that plants don't like. That is totally unnatural. They will not want to grow in this small patch in that manner that you are giving them as a confinement. They will either grow too little or they will grow over it. In fact, what you need to do is to use these simulations on a smaller scale, on the voxel scale as well, and start looking at how your voxel allows a certain unpredictability to happen, and how that from a design point of view happens, but also biological point of view. Because one of the things that is now more and more known is that plants grow well when they grow in a consortia of plants. When they're growing in isolation, they have no stimulus. It becomes really problematic. And that goes from levels of root connections that are more and more known now. Now I know mosses have rhizoids, they don't have really roots, but still they have a microbiome that connects different bacteria together. And it's the relationship between different types of mosses and cryptogams, lichens and algae, etc., that create a biome that is hugely stimulating. The same thing happens, for instance, with light. The more plants are with different leaves next to each other, the more the light reflections stimulate the other plants to grow. So in other words, when you isolate everything into a small square and you say it's only one species that grows within this confinement, you're contradicting entirely the biology and the ecology, but also what you're doing actually on a larger scale. So I think it might be useful to go down to the small scale and use some of the learnings of the larger scale and rethink your voxel slightly to have a bit more of a capability of this unpredictable growth that create then actually very different patterns. And I remember a group that was done in the Morphogenesis lab, which was on spiders, where there was, you know, a confinement, but each piece had its own morphology that was related in the result of each spider's sort of web. In a way, you need to start allowing a bit of complexity and unpredictability of growth to happen in each voxel, because if you've confined it too much to the square, it's not going to work. It's actually conceptually also a contradiction, basically, that you have there. All right?
Yeah, that is exactly something we're working with. Actually, the unit we dimension also in terms of depth is a unit that we were testing in order for the moss to have enough depth and soil and be able to grow. But then the idea was to effectively evolve the prototype and imagine this just as a grid. We have at the moment pushed more the larger scale work also for practical reason. But yeah, that is exactly something that we were testing. What is the depth of soil and what is the quantity of moss that needs to be present at the beginning in each cell for it to be able to grow and be self-sustaining, and then eventually connect to the other cell. That was exactly one of the points of research of the material prototype of this group.
Yeah, it's great.
But this function can also translate at the larger scale in a quite interesting way. Because I was thinking in other aspects, then maybe we move on, but is you know, if you go towards the end of the presentation, I mean, your site is around the Olympic Park here in London, right? And maybe there is something interesting that you can also say in terms of what are you bringing to this site, because obviously this is a very particular area of London that was developed, redeveloped very quickly during and after the Olympics, but at the same time there are still a lot of patches of it that are very low resolution in a way, right? They are still very kind of generic and vague in terms of their recolonization, if you want, from actual buildings as well as nature. So there are all these fringes that at the moment are being, let's say, slowly built over, but at the same time there is still many gaps, and many of these gaps are also filled with water and with other type of aquatic life. So I think there is an element of this sort of idea that you know Marcos is touching upon in, you know, at the scale of the micro scale, which through your gun powered explorations, you are also translating and bringing to the urban scale, which for me has a significance in terms of you know, re-envisioning what's going on here in the Olympic Park, and also suggesting ways of redeveloping the area that are more progressive than the one that we see today implemented, where, you know, the park and the city are once again very clearly segregated, separated, and essentially very much a low res for the moment, no? So I think there is a big margin for this kind of micro articulation to begin to appear at the larger scale and effectively result in a completely new kind of a terrain and territory that sort of enables this kind of a connectivity that Marcos was pointing at. So I think this is another element of narrative that maybe you could begin to highlight and explore further. I think this image is quite impressive. I mean, I think I've seen quite a few, you know, gun kind of experiments around these days, and I think this is one of the best images I've seen so far in terms of resolution and quality, but also I think in terms of the logics that is somehow implying, even if it's still, let's say, sketchy to a certain extent. So I think, but you know, I think you should kind of bring it back to the site and to what is it actually bringing to the discussion at the urban scale as well. And I think it is very clear to me what it can be bringing.
Thank you. So thank you. If there
Can
are
I add one comment?
Yeah, go for it.
So I wanted to relate to the comment from Marcos of the fact that the facade may have a dry and a wet phase, so to speak. And I found it quite fascinating, actually, because then it may be that there is a dry state, which is the one that you design with the positioning of the voxels and everything. And then when moss starts grow, maybe also it completely overrides this subdivision in voxels. So there are patterns of growth that start to emerge that layer on top of what you have, and also going in different directions. And I think that this is something which is would be interesting to visualize and would be interesting as a design outcome. And that also made me think that maybe we can also push the design one step further, thinking that these voxels are not static, but rather something whose position can be rearranged in time. Also, as you had in the introduction, just as an animation, but maybe that can become a design feature. So in order to explore different configurations of this distribution, and also the fact that maybe once we start, imagine that we have a first state, then there is moss growing on top of that, and that the system is able to map this growth, then this mapping can feed again into the configuration. So in a way, there is a feedback loop between the growth of the moss and the displacement of the voxels. Then your facade will start changing in time. And every season there will be a dry state, which is different from the one of the season before, and the wet state, which is going to be different as well. So I think this is something that will be interesting to see also in the drawing. I see pretty practical for the way you're designing to do a catalog of possible states with the simulation that we have been working with. And then that would be interesting to see, I think.
Thank you. I agree. Thanks a lot for the comment. Let's move on to biocoenosis group. Is just one person, Oscar. So we have 3 species we work with. So one is moss, the other is lime mold, and the other is microalgae. So the second group is Oscar working with the slime mold as a form of biocomputation. Oscar?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share first the video, and then I will continue with the presentation. So can everyone see my screen now?
Yeah.
Let me just, the audio, I think I need to put again the audio. Yeah. Okay, I will start the video now.
With the rising temperatures affecting the ozone layer, the glacier poles of the world are melting, which coupled with human growth and evolution is affecting biodiversity the most. This human and non-human invasive coexistence is having side effects such as COVID-19. Since the humans started to invade biodiversity's habitat, the boundary between entities was lost. In order to reduce zoonosis and biodiversity loss, an established boundary with nature regeneration is needed. With the melting glaciers, the sea level rise. Therefore, we are projecting a flood in London that surpasses the current barriers in 200 years. With this flooding, the new water volume will generate marshlands at the edges. A marshland eventually works as a biodiversity generator. Its nutrient distribution between water microorganisms that travel through the soil can grow vegetation suitable for animal species development. In order to bring the marshlands benefits to the inside part of the city, we found the proximity relationship between the bird location points and green area. With this exploration, we extracted the high-density spots, marking them as the most suitable areas for habitation and bird production. These densities, as the optimal habitat locations, were used with slime mold due to its properties to find the optimal path and intelligence connecting food sources. The optimal locations were used as an input for experimenting with slime mold as a biocomputer. After testing the locations, a nutrient distribution network from the marshlands to the inner city was created, bringing the marshland properties to the optimal habitat locations. The slime mold's new network was then applied into the London terrain, and using a generative adversarial network, we generated an eroded morphology that takes the marshland properties and redistributes them along London, thus creating the marshland city. A formation that changes with time and height, recreating a marshland typology combined with the human infrastructure. This results in a new type of interaction whereby providing the non-human the necessary resources to be self-sustained, the bridge to the human infrastructure is reduced. This post-natural city shows a 31% growth of green area, but maintains a delimited boundary between entities. The marshland distribution within the city helps to repopulate the biodiversity loss by bringing the nutrients that grow microorganisms require, and gives the human its area for development without interrupting the non-human. By extracting the human network and infrastructure, we are able to develop a grid that distributes fibers as a steel synthetic nest system where the new human typology is elevated, therefore avoiding the human bridge into the non-human habitat. This system prevents pests and vermin with its elevation, and with the closed fibers, the boundary is redefined. With marshland city and the steel synthetic nest, biodiversity can find its properties to grow. At the same time, different entities coexist with a boundary that can reduce human and non-human interaction issues such as COVID-19. The marshland city uses climate change processes to establish controlled coexistence in a post-natural scenario. The steel synthetic nest allows human on the inside and non-human on the outside, thus creating the biocoenosis nest.
Okay, so now I'm going to continue with the presentation. Can you see right now the cover of the presentation?
Yes, we can see. Keep it compact. So we go for then to the comment. Thank you.
Yeah. So basically, on the previous research on what you saw in the video, we started with London East End research and understanding the many changes that happen with the docklands and the factories, and how this population of the area started to saturate London East End. And with the Second World War, the regeneration of the area that eventually started to impact the surroundings. And with the Anthropocene era, this expanding of the industry and docklands have had an effect on the biodiversity by marking this reduction. And it's not only in London, but everywhere in the world. In East London, we see through the years how this human infrastructure has been consuming the nature in the surroundings. And together with the rise, with the pollution and the gases emission from the human, the temperatures has been rising, and therefore there is this melting in the ice layer of the world. Last week, Norway witnessed the ocean taking part of the land. Something we understand can eventually happen everywhere. And in this case, we projected this scenario in London. In the 200 years, this flooding that surpasses the current flooding barriers of East London. With the marshland generation in this new water volume, creating this new biodiversity node where the microorganisms from water to the soil start to generate new interactions and new nutrients, and this ecosystem starts to grow. We then mapped how the current city works and how the biodiversity and the nature it's combined to find the optimal path. The optimal locations. These optimal locations can give us an understanding of the good areas or suitable spaces for habitat for the non-human. So eventually, with the new water volume, we tested what will happen and what new densities will be created, to then be tested with the slide mode's intelligence on connecting the shortest path, connecting nutrient sources. So if we try to connect the nutrients from the marshland to the inner part of the city, we create a network that the slide mode connected these parts. So bringing the nutrients from the marshland to the optimal habitat locations inside the city. This new network was then tested with GAN. And as a first instance, it was tested as a terrain that generates marshland. So the slide mode network is now transformed into an eroded terrain. So now London East End is shaped with this marshland based on this flooding. So then we tested this marshland with the London city dataset to obtain these results of this morphology that's changing based on the marshland properties. So after the several time in the growth of this erosion, the marsh city is created. Then this marsh city that's eventually, with considering the flooding, starts to give shape of what is the non-human and what is the human typologies in this map. So then later, to try to understand what happens at the architectural scale, what happens with the human and the non-human, once we go inside this marsh city, we started studying the sociable weaverness to understand how there is this coexistence that we're looking at the marsh city between the human and the non-human without a direct interaction that affects both entities. The sociable weaver works like that in nature. So after several understandings and mappings with different parameters, we explored different scenarios of how this synthetic nest can be created with a fiber system. By considering the non-human interaction at the architectural scale, considering zoonosis and vermins, we explored the stilt architecture system by elevating the construction, and this way avoiding any risks with floods and preventing these pests to go easily access the human infrastructure. So then we extracted parts of the GAN generated marsh city, and these paths are created as a basic structure and connectivity network that's elevated from the ground, and then the human infrastructure and volumes that become eventually this synthetic nest. So after using this extraction and this generation with the stilt synthetic nest design, we then applied it into the grid that grows around the east end of London to eventually create a terrain that it's based on the marsh city, but works with this architecture method that avoids the direct interaction and creates a boundary. So first we have the first layer as a basic structure that elevates from the ground. then the volumes start to generate, having higher densities in the fibers to create closer boundaries and open boundaries, depends on the uses that are happening in there, and eventually having this new city development, this post-natural scenario. So to finish the presentation, this smart city redistributing the human and the non-human using climate change processes and the still synthetic nest, creating a boundary between the human and the non-human, this post-natural city generates a controlled coexistence with a balanced interaction. This is the bioeconosis nest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks, Oscar. I will open the comment to whoever wants to.
Can I make some comments? Actually, the project's really interesting. I think launches a lot of very fascinating issues, and I wanted to pick up on this image that you have currently on your screen. It's so fascinating that in pretty much every single country in the world, especially those which have a lot of flat wetlands, what we have done was for around 200 years, we have dried out land. You know, you take the examples of the Netherlands, Israel, and Florida, in the UK partly, etc. The strategies have been about drying out with certain vegetation land in order to gain land and conquer land to the sea. But now we are starting to invert it entirely. We are starting to realize that we can't do that. We are going to be occupied in large chunks by seawater. So this drying out land process has obviously created enormous ecological and hydrological problems that we have managed with dikes and other strategies to overcome, but now with rising sea waters, we can't overcome anymore. Now, what in the Netherlands, presumably they have found out now quite a few years ago, is rather than trying to build higher dikes, is actually to accept fresh water in large quantities in order to suppress the seawater, the salt water that is coming from underneath. And there I think there is a sectional thinking that maybe your project needs to engage with, because your project has currently a very 2D map planimetric logic, which is really interesting, and I want to come back to that. But I think sectionally, to understand what this situation of seawater means, salt water coming into areas of the Lee Valley and so on and of East London, what that means, I think needs to be understood sectionally, because it might not be visible everywhere. You could to a large extent suppress it if fresh water is actually on top, because it has weight. And there I want to ask you something, which I think potentially is really interesting in this map that you have here, is what the middle points are. They look like the generative points of urban distribution. But what are the middle points? Because I think your water that you have a sort of a continuous area that exists in between these sort of islands is interesting, but I think there is something potentially in the middle of them that might even ecologically be far more important, which is when all these, I guess, sort of gardens come together, they have a point. Now, I don't know if this point is a peak topographically, or if this is actually a dipping point. And I think they might be both. You might differ in different cases. Points of topographic height, but points of moments where you have actually water in the middle. And I give you a very mundane example here. I built a few years ago a pond in our garden. You know, basically the garden looked like exactly like all the other backyards in London, which is green plots of land and not a lot of biodiversity, to be honest, because they are so enclosed that there's very little that can survive apart from some squirrels and some birds. But just a small spot of water has recalibrated entirely the wildlife of the entire area. One mini small pond in one garden. to the point that I'm starting to survey what is actually happening because the change is so dramatic. Now, in your case, on a much larger scale, these middle points, these middle contained freshwater areas could be really fascinating. They could actually, in section, rebalance the weights of salt water and freshwater because we have lack of freshwater. But also ecologically, they could really create a biodiversity that would be really unparalleled. And it might need a bit of a research here briefly into how freshwater wetlands have a biodiversity that you might bring back into this, rather than the marshlands that had salt water, which are slightly different types of ecosystems. But I really like the idea that these sort of areas, nearly sort of island areas, are created with the middle points, and the middle points really are generative, socially even, ecologically. I think they have a great potential. What I'm missing here is a network of infrastructure. I miss a network of roads, of connectivity. I know we are all confined and we are not connecting with each other currently, but everybody's sort of getting desperate to connect again and be on the road again. And I think there needs to be some level of connectivity between these different islands that seem to be now quite segregated. And I think that could be a juxtaposed network that comes from the Slimal readings of nodes of communication between these actually rather self-regulated, ecologically self-regulated islands that you have created. But it's a fascinating proposition, really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Very great, good comment. I'm not going to comment because I know the project quite well, and I would like to leave the space to the guest. Other comment from the guest, or Oscar, you want to answer something?
No, I'm just here.
For me, what would be interesting to hear, and I agree with Marcus, it's a fascinating, beautiful project. I commend you, really beautiful work. And I love the whole idea of London becoming Venice almost in this sort of scenario. But I would be interested to hear more your decision-making process a little bit. How did you arrive at this particular image? Because in the design search, when you're working with guns on this, I'm sure there were many, many instances, and it would be interesting to unveil that process more. What were the different versions, potential futures of this project, and how you were making decisions as well. So that could be quite interesting, because it's a quite new method of working on this type of projects. But also you said 200 years from now, that's a bit risky to go so far in the future, I would say. It's very, first of all, can we all even talk about humans at that point? But in terms of the connectivity that Marcus was talking about, maybe something that has to do with, again, and as I said, London becoming Venice, so the network of canals or something like that could be interesting as well to analyze as a connectivity infrastructure, this very rich network. But in terms of other large networks and infrastructures, I would imagine that this is extremely distributed, again, in terms of energy production, in terms of local biomes, this kind of local ponds or pockets of so it could also be interesting. I agree also with this comment that we need to go into more dimensions than just looking at this from the top. So what are the end dimensions that you can mine in that kind of deeper field? And yes, definitely section would be a place to start. So I'm fading a little bit here on this end, but very beautiful project.
Actually, Alisa, I wanted to follow up on what you were saying. It might be worth analyzing and actually designing more one of those islands and see really how much, even from the experience we are currently having, they become nearly autonomous areas from, a point of view of how people even work nowadays, how modes of production are becoming decentralized. And
Yes.
we noticed that one of the biggest learning curves was we were talking about decentralization for a while, but actually applying a totally centralized mode of production. Mm-hmm. And what this pandemic has forced us is to implement decentralization in terms of strategies that people have to be in their place and be able to apply what they are talking about. And I think I'm calling them islands. I don't know if they're exactly islands, but these sort of plots, they are starting to suggest that there could be, because they're quite big, a setting whereby the amount of people who live with these bits of land have a nearly a self-sustained way of life, and the production modes might be decentralized and scattered along these different islands. And the term I like a lot, which I actually just learned a few months ago, is this condition of the ecotone as this ecological transition zone, which is far more fascinating than the pure ecologies that one says, oh, this is a forest, or this is a marshland, or this is a... Actually, marshlands are really interesting because they are ecotones in their own right. They are transition zones. They're very blurry. There are lots of unpredictable things happening. And because they also have moments of receding water and growing water, these differentiations of more presence of water, less, create an enormous change. And I like this idea that there's a multi-layered design and analysis of what these plots with this type of dimension could actually start creating in a non-hierarchical manner, as we have in cities where, oh, everybody has to go to the center, or production is only happening in the sort of modernist idea of the industrial area. No, this seems to be that these plots have a piece of industry, a piece of housing, a piece of social, a piece of, ecological, but still networked. Of course they are, but they have a right size, I have the feeling. And water presence will allow a lot of an economy also to evolve with it, which could be really fascinating, that you look at sort of a few types of those style of islands that could be analyzed a bit more in detail and designed more in detail, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, very much with this, but also probing the density could be another dimension of that, because it's not quite clear. And one idea that I'm kind of working a lot with lately is the idea of extreme densities occurring in the same space as wilderness. So this idea that you could probe densities of human and non-human agencies. And yes, it's a good idea, design of the island, one of these chunks, patches.
That Alisa is suggesting already something fascinating. You take an island and you give it different levels of density, and they will change massively, because the needs then change. Yeah. The interactions with the other islands change immediately, because one is you have only a few houses and looks a bit sort of suburbia with a few, isolated houses around, nice gardens in the back. But if you pack it with 10,000 people in one island, or even more than that, then it's a completely different dynamic. Then it starts.
Yeah, 1 million. And yeah, exactly. Extreme, because we are going towards 10 billion people, and not in 200 years, but in the next maximum 20 years. So we will need to build either more cities, or I'm very, even though at the moment everyone is against cities and density, but I think we need to challenge ourselves more to work on high density, but of a different kind, and coexisting with these natural elements. And especially since, and I'm sure that's been the case in London as well, but here in central Melbourne, where I live, suddenly during the lockdown, we started having more birds and more wildlife in the center of the city. So it was very, then I started working on this concept of extreme densities and wilderness in the same space. And I think it's achievable. It's quite intriguing. So this project
it reminds the topic of negotiation somehow. All the other species, they have to negotiate their habit also on a daily basis. They have to change every time the habit where they are, because of nature is also a dangerous force. It's not only something with which just to coexist. So maybe we could also think that somehow this is a topic how human, as you were talking with human and non-human, maybe we could try to blend this definition of human and non-human and to think of what's the negotiation you have to do as a membrane, with all the environment you're living in. That is the ecotone philosophy, somehow this idea that the conditions are continuously changing. So there's frictions, there's conflict, there's competition, but there's also a continued rebalancing of environment that probably could be also undertaken with this solution.
Oscar, there is
I just had another thought,
which I liked a lot.
Yeah.
No, go for it. I mean, I just wanted Oscar to go back a couple of slides.
Yeah.
There was one image, the first one you showed of this, which had a kind of a overall circular form, which which I found that it was quite, I think, could be a nice background of some of this conversation, because it sort of gave yeah, I think this one was one of the first one you had, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, yeah, and then there was this one, and I can see that's quite literally related to your slime mold experiment, right? But at the same time, I was wondering what could be the size of this.
Well, this is mapped on a 10 kilometer diameter. The diameter is 10 kilometer on London East 10. This is the testing area where I ran the algorithm.
Because all of a sudden, from just saying, okay, this is 10 kilometer diameter, I think you can begin to extrapolate a whole series of scalar or resolutions, just by investigating that, and which I think will just bring up so many interesting considerations on the line of the comments Marco, Lisa, and Ingrid were making, just by declaring these kind of scalar ranges. And of course, you can then change them and tune them, and they could be fluctuating to a certain extent. But I think it's good to bring them into your narrative. Otherwise, there is a risk at some point that we kind of lose a bit the sense of where we are, what's the scale, and at the same time, so I think that's a really important element, I think.
Thank you.
I think the suggestion of touching on or looking at a prototype that could be an island or could be larger, and touching also on the changes that the current pandemic is bringing, not only in the relationship between human and wilderness, but also in overall human production habits. So what are our current production trends and how they could change? I think it's an important one, because you were touching on the pandemic, because of course you were working with wilderness and especially with birds that are some of the main vehicle, subspecies of birds of this type of virus. So it was kind of important for you to touch on that, but how this also involves other changing, I think could bring a more, developed brief to the project. Okay.
Claudia, one last very quick small suggestion. I think Oscar showed some image what had to do with some of the animals somewhere. And I just was going to say that something that is becoming of increasing importance for ecologists is the notion of the keystone species. The idea that, yes, biodiversity is very important. Yeah, that was this page. Biodiversity is important, surely, but actually there's certain keystone species that are more important than others for the succession of what happens ecologically. And I wonder what in the marshlands the keystone species are. Because as far as I'm concerned, rats or rabbits are not necessarily keystone species, neither are foxes. But for instance, in one of the books that I was reading, keystone species in a certain environment are earthworms or beavers, or in fact the herbivorous animals that eat grass and shrubs, etc. They're keystone species because they transform the landscape. And maybe rather than you showing a sort of generic page with some animals and us talking about, oh, there's coexistence of animals and humans, maybe you need to look at what in marshlands would be the keystone species that entirely change. I mean, beavers are considered the architects of the landscape because they build dams, they change everything, and then the ecology that follows them is just insane. And beavers were nearly extinct in Europe. They remained in some Ukrainian part and one tiny spot in Germany and somewhere in Russia, but have been now introduced all over Europe because of their huge importance, because of this succession. That is not only them, is what happens afterwards with all the other animals that come. So maybe there's something on that level that might need a bit of an understanding that certain species really matter, and they have also an impact on resolving some of these drawings that you are then sort of creating. Because it's really it's a project that has a lot of a polemic and really is starting to suggest something very interesting, how we could occupy such pieces of land. And clearly, as Alisa was saying, I wouldn't put it in 200 years. I would put it much sooner. I think it's much more pertinent.
Yes, probably the number of years could be sharpened a little bit.
I have to say bye-bye because unfortunately I have a presentation to make. So it was great to see these two projects. I'm going to miss the third one, but amazing stuff.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Really good work.
Thank you, Marcos.
Thank you.
So in the meantime, while Marcos leaves us, there is Liz Werner that joined for the last project. Hi, Liz. She's still.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Claudia.
Hi.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining. So Liz is an architect in Berlin. Is a professor at U Berlin Institute of Architecture and is leading the C5 Lab, Cyber Physical System for Architecture and Urban Design. She will also be hosting the next ECAD conference that we are looking forward to. Okay, so the City in Bloom project.
Okay. Hello everyone, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, we can. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because my dormitory is still under construction, so now my room is super noisy. I don't know whether it will affect the presentation. Okay, let's start with the video. So can you see the screen of the YouTube?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe you can start now. So we'll start with the video, and this video will show the major content of our project, and then we come to the presentation. In the presentation, we will major explain the research we made to support the design project. Okay. What? Sorry. What's wrong with that? I'm sorry, maybe because of the construction, my network is affected. I'm so sorry. Maybe we can try to.
Where is the voice?
Is that you now? Can you hear me?
We can't hear the voice.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. So okay. Let's just restart about that. I don't know what's wrong with the network.
rows. Trabajan como en un solo level. O sea, yo esa parte no la entiendo porque trabajan ellas en un solo level. Porque no debería. O sea, se puede mostrar mucho mejor eso. Fuck.
Sorry, I am mute.
Okay, go.
Okay, so I'll start to share the screen of the presentation. I'm sorry for the network problem. Actually, it's a little bit hard for our group because two of my teammates are in China now, so their network is still not steady. So none of us have a steady network. Okay, so let's start with the presentation. So our project name is City in Blooms, and this is a proposal for a photosynthetic city based on the urban algae farming. So our project starts with a discussion of some problems, which is the population growth and the urban sprawl, which caused the loss of the farmland, and the over-farming and land degradation problem, which caused food shortage, as well as the fossil fuel consumption, which will finally lead to the energy crisis. So therefore, we assume a miserable future, which if we do not change anything with the existing city, then we may face the ecological crisis, land degradation, food shortage, and greenhouse effect. Therefore, all of this calls for the new city type, which is photosynthetic city, which could performing the photosynthesis to grow energy, provide food, produce material, and digest the urban waste itself. So then the question comes to how to realize those photosynthetic city, and the solutions comes from another issue, global issue, which is the algae blooms. And the algae blooms, the consequence of the water contamination and global warming, and they are caused by different types of microalgae species. And the microalgae are kind of species which are super efficient when performing photosynthesis, converting light and carbon dioxide into oxygen and biomass. And they are also the high yield biofuel crops, high nutrition superfood, and the high efficient carbon sequestration machine. Therefore, microalgae are the most potential photosynthetic source for the city. So to fulfill the potential of the microalgae, the algae farming is the most important process. Therefore, our design motive is to integrate algae farming and processing into a synthetic landscape, which could act as a photosynthetic infrastructure of the city. And this infrastructure would grow energy and food, process product, and improve air quality, as well as provide public space for the city. And this is what we call the city in blooms. And so the first part of our design is the morphogenesis of this photosynthetic infrastructure. We start with the selection of the algae farming hotspots. So we studied the factors and condition of algae farming, and we decide to gather the light pollution, carbon emission, and water pollution data of the city to help us choose the site. So first of all, we have the microalgae blooms in London, which could be the source of microalgae. And then we gathered light pollution, air pollution, and water pollution data. And we made a pollution ranking list of the available sites. And the available sites is the farming allotment, green space site, as well as the brownfield. So based on that, we select the 100 places which have the highest pollution value as the center of the photosynthetic infrastructure. And in the next stage, we start to develop the circulation system for that. So first of all, we divide London by the Voronoi diagram, and then we use the shortest path algorithm to make the circulation system. So those kind of algorithm can give us multiple fibers, morphologies, and we choose this type. We adapt this typology to the whole London map. Therefore, we can have a master plan of the infrastructure for London. And as you can see that those fibers have different densities, and the densities is determined by the pollution value. So our idea is that those photosynthetic infrastructure would take the pollution as a nutrient, and it will just grow on the substrates of London. So the third part is the datascape making. So datascape is a data processing and design tool we introduced in our project. It is made out of the fibrous morphologies. So it could also bring new details as well as new features to the morphology we had before. So we choose this type of parameter because it could add more branches for the infrastructure, and we adapt those type of parameters to our London whole city datascape. Then we zoom in and focus on the Bargo Yards East in East London, and this is the site of our design. Okay, then we come to the second stage, which is the design of the synthetic landscape. First of all, we can generate point cloud on the datascape, and those point cloud can be controlled by different parameters. We explore much on that, and then we select this set of parameters which could keep the feature of the datascape. So we adapt it to our own design. We get the datascape of our site datascape, and then we apply the geometry to each point. So all the datascape and other point cloud comes together, and this can give us different typology of those synthetic landscape. So when we are trying to decide the typology, we make the research of the algae farming integration of the construction environment. We try to summarize the typology, the material system of those design cases. So we find that the plastic film is most suitable one for us to develop. Therefore, we find that the most suitable forms for our synthetic landscape may be the cube, because it's very easy for us to realize by the film bioreactor. And then we start to decide the size of those units. So we also made comparison of three types of units in large scale, medium scale, and small scale. And we summarize all of them space features and decide to make the synthetic landscape with multiple sizes. So in the 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer site, we make 8 meters units, 4 meters units, 2 meters, and well as 1 meters. And then we have the design result for the synthetic landscape. So the third part is the assemblage and photobioreactor design. So we split our synthetic landscape into different pieces, so that we also made exploration on that, and we find that 64 meter is the most suitable size for that tile. So we can make different assemblage from those kind of tiles. And we take one of them as an example. So this would help us to push straightforward design on the facade, because this kind of units are made out of the plastic film bioreactor. So we study those kind of reactor and find that the most important feature for this one is the welding lines, because it needs welding line to support algae inside. Then we make the material experiment on the welding technology and pattern. We select the heat sealer as the process method because it is easy to operate, and also it is very fast to process. And this also determines that the pattern for this facade should only be the straight lines. So therefore, we use the straight lines with different lengths to make our patterns. And if we zoom in, we can see that those curves can still make some pattern. And then we divided the surface of the cube into 1 meter by 1 meters panels so that we can get the patterns for the plastic film photobioreactor. So next part is the making of the material prototype. We cultivate 4 types of algae, and we find that 3 types of them are very easy to cultivate and can be applied in our design. And we also compare different types of culture substrates, as well as making the material tests of different plastic. As a result, we choose the water-absorbing crystals as well as the ETFE as our materials to make the material prototype. And this is the result of our material prototype. And we use specific device to record the carbon dioxide it absorbs so that we can have different data. And we also try to frame one of them, and maybe it can have a better possibility to connect with each other. So based on the data we collect, we finally find a way to quantify our synthetic landscape, which is by the carbon dioxide absorption data. And then the last part of our design is the transformation of the existing city. So because this photosynthetic city is built based on the photosynthetic infrastructure, so we adapt the morphologies of the photosynthetic infrastructure to the city, and we can have different types of infrastructure forms. The first one and the second one, third one, and they have different percentages of the green space and the buildings. This is the last one. So we choose the last one because we think it has the highest carbon dioxide absorbing value. And then we adapt this type of cyclogen techniques to the large scale area of London. So by that, we finally transform this city area into this kind of forms, and this is the city in bloom. So actually, that's all for our design. That's all we have for the midterm. So for the next stage, we plan to focus on the assemblage. For example, now we apply the pattern everywhere on the facade, but we try to develop the patterns according to the microclimate data of the specific space. And then we studied the process workflow of the algae farming, and we can start to do the interior function design, and as well as try to work more on the structure for the assemblage. This will help us to better materialize those proposals. And that's all for our project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thanks. I'll open to comments.
I think it's a beautiful project, and the thing that I really do understand with this project, which I think wasn't as strong in the other two, is actually that interface at the human scale, where you actually see the materialization of the microalgae in relationship to the algorithms that are generating the patterns and protocols for organizing space. What I'm less clear about is kind of the landscape patterning. From what I've understood, you've generated patterns and then selected ones that you've arbitrarily thought are, more carbon dioxide absorbing than others. And I'm a little, let's say, I'm a little more circumspect about the narratives that are at the actual macro scale, which is actually the opposite to the previous two projects. So yeah, so for me, the organization of the urban environment in relationship to this technology is a little unclear. And I think for all of these projects, I'd really like some sense of time, you know, so if you're, you know, how fast do these cities go up? I mean, are these things that are made by generations? Are they something that is just suddenly constructed, you know, as a 2-year building program? You know, I'm kind of looking for the methods of implementation and the kind of the temporal engagement. So I think one of the challenges for all the 3 projects is that the substrate is temporal and it's contextual, and so it won't stay the same. So unlike a built city, and even that you could argue about it, that there's actually something much more seasonal, temporal, contextual, and indicative of how that city performs. So how do we now read the city now that it's photosynthetic? Or is it just a utilitarian narrative that you're going to give about carbon dioxide? Are there notions of aesthetics or beauty or changing color or rereading the seasons, or a sense of feeling good, or a sense of, you know, increased space or connection with nature? There are qualitative aspects of your proposal that I think are missing. And for me, the narrative about how your geometries, you know, at the large scale, have been selected, I think I'd like to hear. I don't really understand all the connections, and it just feels a bit arbitrary to me. I don't think it needs to. I think it's about narrative development. But yeah, those are the main things that have come forward in this presentation. But I think it's very good. I'm very impressed by the prototype. I mean, I think they're stunning, you know, and the idea of this kind of tiny vertical city. Like, I mean, I think you could really kind of bring it out as being something weird and wonderful. I mean, this is like a city layered over a city. This is a city of palimpsests, right? So you've got a human city, you've got a kind of a microalgae city. You've kind of got tensions and layers that don't exist in what we would conventionally think of a city. And, you know, the nature seems to be vertical. And then we've got, a synthetic version of nature. So there's some incredible potential in this project. And, I really think that, in your next weeks, drawing that forth and kind of really tying the great visualizations that you've generated together with a really persuasive argument would go a very long way.
Yeah, Marco, you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can add. I think whereas the project before, for instance, for me had a much more, let's say, landscape kind of direction in terms of, and when you think about the time variable, I don't know, it suggested it's really long-term kind of evolution and differentiation of new species, etc. In your case, I think this project for me has a much more kind of infrastructural approach in a way. So it's almost like I see this as a kind of the implementation of a really huge urban algae farm as a kind of intensive algae farming system, but which nevertheless it doesn't follow the logics of let's say pure production, which we see in current algae farms, which are usually completely removed from urban lives and the urban fabric, but rather tries to incorporate these practices and these protocols within. So in that sense, I kind of almost imagine your project to evolve into some kind of a mega structure, almost like a sort of a huge warehouse that it's so big that within itself it sort of becomes a new form of landscape, which is effectively devoted to production. In this case, it could be biomass, bioenergy production, but at the same time, because of its articulation, is capable of negotiating and hosting all sorts of other species and layers of life. Therefore, it becomes actually inhabitable in multiple ways, and not exclusively devoted to production like the ones that we see today. So in that case, I think that this image that you're showing now, for instance, maybe out of scale in a way. If I remember the way it's generated, it seems to be occupying like the whole of London or something. Or I'm a bit lost to the scale of it. But I think like if you begin to kind of combine this kind of technique with some of the diagrams of a system and that you showed before, and kind of find a range of scale that is in between the one, let's say, of, I don't know, Tesla gigafactory on one side and the kind of landscape of the Lee Valley, for instance, like just to give you a sort of idea. And how is that beginning to coalesce into this sort of new type of productive landscape? Then I think you can find a really exciting narrative that's going to bring this together and eventually leads you to a more credible and exciting output.
I think that's really interesting, Marco, because one of the things that this raises is about the notion of an urban commons, right? Because there is a notion of, this doesn't have to be, let's say, Tesla's factory. This could actually be farming for the people, bringing back the commons into the urban by creating vertical spaces.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes a very interesting environment where ownership of space and resource and energy and light and nature is shared again. So I think there's something really interesting about what you've just proposed and the scale of it, so that actually we can start to relate to people, their lives, and what these kinds of fabrics and technologies, materials, however you describe them, bring to a city in a way that it becomes desirable in a way that other cities lack. And I think there's something really quite magical about what you're proposing, and I just think you need to dig down into the kind of, as Marco said, the infrastructural narratives that allow people to live their lives differently or better, or kind of in ways that become strange.
I have a question actually for you guys. Thank you first of all for your presentation. Now, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that you have chosen algae for the capabilities of energy production, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if we look into the infrastructural issue, that was your second point, that you said we're looking into infrastructure. My question is, how do you deal with the other parts of infrastructure? Because at the moment you're going in an exorbitant way towards, the greenness, this green gold that you're kind of, trying to harvest within London. But how does it work with other infrastructure, like tracks for bicycles, for pedestrians, underwater infrastructure, underground infrastructure that's such as water? How does it work with also settlements? And this is where I would like to respond a little bit to what Rachel said. Like on one hand, you're trying to connect to the humans with your project by showing also facade elements. On the other hand, it looks as if you're trying to have a look into this general common space that we are trying to reclaim in some cities. But how do you put all these parameters into the project? And I think we would need to start from the very beginning, where you grid the city, where you divide the area into a grid. Can you show this slide where you divide it?
I think it's this one.
I think it's this one.
Yeah.
So I think the first question is, what are these crosses? What are these points that you're looking at here? And are these ones that you've chosen, is that particular parameter that you've chosen to determine those points, is that really the parameter that is, let's call it, the right one. Because everybody would probably decide for a different parameter, or maybe take several parameters together and create a matrix, or have a different method. So the question is, the first step towards your methodology, how do you actually justify this? How do you explain that? Because the first step is the crucial one. Everything else is dependent on this particular step. And what I'm missing at the moment a little bit, which will come, I'm sure, in the future, is a diagram of decision logics. So when did you decide what, why, and with which material, let's say that. So this is a lot of stuff, but I was like collecting over the last 25 minutes. So you can respond to whichever you want.
Yeah, I don't know whether we just choose a wrong thing, because if we say that we are designing a park or some landscape, then I think the problem may be much easier than design an infrastructure. Because I know that the decision process for infrastructure is very complicated, and we also try to understand how they choose the landscape infrastructure, and they need large amounts of data, as well as a very complicated process to manipulate on the data to set up the evaluation system. So I don't know, I don't know, maybe I cannot manage to set up that system, but I mainly want to propose this kind of way. Maybe my data is not the right one, but there might be someone can work better on the data. So yeah, at that time, they give us the better, the data, and we can have better decision of that place. Yeah.
I think it's not so much about working computationally with the data. It's more the question, which data set are you choosing in the first place? The same question applies to how did you decide upon the 1 meter cube, the 2 meter cube, the 4 meter cube? Why is it 1? Why is it not 1.5? So I'm asking all these questions because they are basically the questions which determine not only the formal outcome of your architecture, but they also determine the discussions that we do have about what is the relationship of the human within a space of 4 meter or 8 meter or 2 meter. And what is the relation of the material, the green material within the gridded, the three-dimensional gridded landscape that you have. So it's not so much detailing the computation in terms of the technicalities, it's more the methodology that you choose.
Yes, I completely agree, and thank you so much for suggesting us that maybe we can work more on the, the scale, and as you say that why it is 1 meter rather than 1.5 meters. And at that time, we just continue with 1 meter, and maybe we find some problems, and then we can go back to change that, I think, maybe.
I mean, maybe it's not so relevant for your project anyways, but I'm just asking these questions.
No, I think that qualitatively looking both at the data, then at the aspect of the biological element that is integrated in your prototype is really important. And I think is, as has been pointed out until now, it's a question of how you reframe your narrative. I don't think you should focus on elements that are necessarily detail of practical constraint like the welding machine and etc. But you should focus on what are the qualitative aspects that allow the project to emerge, but also to evolve. Otherwise, if you shift the narrative in hyperfunctionality, we will end up needing to produce CO2 to sustain your algae farm, because otherwise the algae don't have enough CO2, for example, just to name one of the issues. The question is different, that the system qualitatively change in time and create after effect that you might expect or you might not, but then it create a new city. That's what a new common and etc. as it is being discussed. That is the aspect that I think you should try to incorporate in the narrative itself.
Yeah, I think it will also jump on the imaginary of the infrastructure like I have this technical bias, so I was looking at the final one where you start thinking of the system with the cushion and the steel structure. I think this could be also interesting, because when there's the scale up, it becomes immediately enormous algae, microalgae farms with no identity just because you have to produce biomass. While otherwise, if you want to go into quality of your system, you have to scale it very down, let's say. So I think in your project, you could find this middle scale where there's a quality also in the design of the material system that in any case has performances and can work and can let's say route your city system, your diagrams, but has also a technological quality somehow. So not going too deep in it, but at least this is, I think, a middle object that usually it's tricky, let's say, because if you have a small scale, you can handle it. When you scale it very big, it becomes this imaginario, at least, of big microalgae farms with no value from an architectural point of view. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think a little bit of playing around with this kind of, let's say, circular flows that your project implies, and kind of give a size to them, which automatically tie in the different resolutions that you
What kind of what?
Who's that? Okay, anyway.
Who are you asking about?
That's Alexa.
Oh my God,
That's fun.
my phone is crazy. All right, sorry guys, I don't know what's going on. It's cool, and it does its own thing. Anyway,
that was Marco's phone asking question to Marco.
Sorry. Well, I was thinking, for instance, you're talking about carbon dioxide inputs, pollution inputs, like how much input is necessary for the algae culture to grow, and how much that quantity is per unit of your pixel, and how that relates to the kind of amount of biomass output that you're able to create, and how that ties in with, for instance, you were talking about nutrients, you were talking about food, you can talk about bioplastics, other outputs of the algae. But the question for me is, if you begin to have unit measures that give you a sense of how these flows can be spatially articulated, then I think it becomes kind of more also clear, what your voxels or your pixel represent in terms of, let's say, the closed metabolism that you are trying to materialize. And I mean, this is an exercise that we have been doing quite a lot in some of the projects that you've done here in the studio, working with microalgae, really using the projects not only as a way of testing, let's say, whether the system would grow and the algae would actually work, but really as a way of materializing, manifesting the kind of metrics and the spatial significance of actually bringing algae within, let's say, the urban realm or the architectural fabric, right? And what does it give you, and what do you need to give back to these cultures for the whole thing to make sense, and what is the actual material effect of that, right? So I think that's for me where this really exciting scaffolding that you have created, that is operating in between the numerical, the computational, and the material, that kind of creates a really perfect terrain for you to begin to make these speculations. But I think you need to make them and just see what happens out of them. What kind of scenarios emerge out of these equations.
So thank you everybody for the comment, and the juror for contributing, the student. I wonder whether there are some final remarks from some of the jurors on the overall project. Rachel was already mentioning that she was interested to know more about the temporality of the project in general, but I wonder whether there is some other suggestion for the student. They will have another presentation later during the summer and then the final submission in September.
So I would like to suggest something. You're going from this very beautiful and poetic landscape, which looks very beautiful and poetic from above, into a more or less standardized gridded facade. And I was wondering if you see an option to translate your wonderful large-scale organic poetic structure into this very vertical that you are suggesting on your cube. So the idea is to use this similar pattern of the landscape aspect for the more micro architectural aspect within the habitats, let's say that. So can you get away from the cube is my question into a landscape in all scales?
I think very briefly as a final comment for all the projects, I would invite you to imagine how people experience and live within them. Just, you know, what kinds of cities are they? How fast do they develop? Who owns them? Just get a sense of who's living there and, you know, the quality of existence that your work is enabling.
Yeah, this question of ownership is also quite relevant. Came around, especially for the first project that was working on social housing at the beginning. And so what does it mean if you integrate non-human form of intelligence and you start to talk about this relationship with them and with other species? So how does ownership eventually change?
Yeah, please go. Yeah, maybe also go for some, I know it's distance, social distancing, but I'm sure that some prototyping could maybe be helpful, no? I don't know if we can try to find a surrogate of the prototyping to work and understand this materiality, how it could work. This could be maybe a suggestion. That probably you do it usually in your course and now it's missing. Do we have a chance to make it, I don't know, a digital materiality or understand how it will change also our imaginario, as now we are blocked and somehow we cannot see the real physical material?
Well, there are elements, I feel, of the machine learning that they apply to the large scale that, especially in the first group, I think could be translated. There are similar type of algorithms that are applied to advanced agriculture. So when we're talking also with Marcus about the growth of the moss, I thought that certain type of growth experiment could be still conducted at the moment in the situation in which we are, and we could use similar algorithm to the one applied to the large scale to then develop more this idea of gardening, enhanced gardening that was part of the initial prototype. But I think this is an aspect of research or a line of research that I think will be interesting in this content to bring forward.
I mean, I just wanted to add something very quickly about the presentations. I think they were, I kind of enjoyed them a lot, all of them, I have to be honest. I think they were really great, but I think they were still very kind of a linear, no, in their progression. And maybe that makes sense until this point of the year. But I think for me now, it's really a good moment to begin to let go a little bit, especially some of the elements that maybe you feel are not so urgent or necessary anymore to the point where you are, and maybe just leave them in the background a little bit and try to kind of loosen up a bit the flow so that you allow these kind of narratives or these kind of more critical questions that have emerged also in the conversation today to take over. Because otherwise the risk I feel a little bit is that you may get into this you know, kind of overproduction situation where you just keep doing stuff because you don't know necessarily how to end or how to wrap it up, right? And I think that that's always a bit of a risk and you know, although there is a certain enjoyment in kind of producing this kind of thing in itself, I'm sure, but I think at this point is probably the moment in which you need to kind of allow a certain distance for that kind of narratives to emerge, and therefore also you can find some more clear ambition towards how you may want to wrap up the project and what is really the project trying to say, and then you focus your production in that direction rather than, you know, just continuously applying new techniques over and over again on the output of the previous step, right? Because I think that's the moment to do that, I feel. And maybe the great feedback here today, you know, just try to take this feedback on and, you know, maybe allow some elements that right now feel a bit redundant to take second stage and you know, just really focus on how you wrap it up in that sense.
Thank you. Filippo, Manos, any?
Now, maybe a very quick concluding remark, just saying that, I mean, all the work, especially the two last one, seems to me very, very interesting and quite strong. I kind of agree with the remark about the flow of time, in a sense, in those projects. You know, because it gives us the feeling that everything is in a kind of static state, which is really wrong, because everything is based on data, and those data are constantly moving at some point. So I think taking into account the dynamics of time in a much more radical way is key for this project. So I would definitely also go in that direction. You know.
Yeah, also it can become too expressive. Maybe some of the video or the passages from the original vision of the city to the transformed one should allow us to see this in time as a gradual transformation, and also define in this time what actually happened prototypically. What are the changes that this entail, rather than in these two frames. I think this will be important. And for some of the people, also the group working with material, also the material transformation. So there are this scale of time that are very different, but that, yeah, for me are very important.
Yeah. And also I would add something else, is that, you know, one with these proposals about new urban organizations, in a sense, just imagine that we would build those scenarios. They would last for probably like 30 years, you know, at least 20, 25 years, these houses, the road patterns, all the infrastructure. So there is, I would say, a kind of, but that's the word contradiction of architecture, which is by definition extremely slow compared to everything else. So we use here the most recent data and the most advanced tools. I mean, basically machine learning and artificial intelligence methods, etc. So we use all these tools in order to create something which is relevant today, again, according to the data we have. But because we are creating something that will last for 30 years, obviously, maybe in 10 years, those urban scenarios will already be completely obsolete. And I think this is a theoretical issue that needs to be addressed in the different projects, because ultimately what is proposed is something which is kind of static. I mean, not only because it's not taking it's not paying attention to the flow of time in the representation or in the formal hypothesis, but most of all because it's about the physical nature of architecture. You know, it's about the road, it's about the building, the green spaces, the urban patterns. All of those things are kind of static. if you look at, for example, how these spaces would be occupied or used, maybe it would be a bit less static because functions change over time much quicker than the walls. You know, I mean, we all know, for example, very famous example in architecture history. You know, some buildings, they were churches, then they became hospital, then they became art galleries, then they you know, like, I mean, functions change over time much faster than buildings. So I think also this, let's say, dialectics between functions and buildings, or functions and urban patterns or infrastructure, should also be addressed, I think, in a more critical way.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, fantastic. I will pick up on Philippe's kind of last remark, and I think it's good to start thinking in critical terms, as Philippe has suggested, planning as provisional and not as dogmatic. I mean, we do kind of projections, but at the same time we have the agility to kind of revise these planning techniques. So it's not a matter of dynamics, but it's a matter of be ready to revise our plans and to redirect the societal realm into different directions by constantly devising new value frameworks and readjust according to that. I know that everyone is talking about this kind of dynamic and time. I really like the fact that most of the groups, they take into consideration the imperceptible to us time, which is the planetary scale time or time scale, which is not maybe apparent to us, but all of them, they have movements that have dynamics that is beyond our kind of phenomenal world. And instead of introducing this kind of phenomenal dynamism, I really appreciate that the students have actually tried to deal with what is not perceptive to us as time. But my last point is I really kind of enjoyed all the progress of the students, and actually instead of time I would like to focus on space, and now space is becoming really kind of a super strong provisional dynamic aspect through which they can, as Rachel rightly said, reimagine the whole societal realm. And what I call societal realm is not here again constrained in the human realm. Actually, the societal realm encapsulates and reorients the whole planetary forces. You call it ecology, you call it society. I would like not to go into this kind of category. I would call it the planetary societal realm. And all the students, all the groups, they have this kind of rich spatial imprint at their hands. They can start speculating about all the nitty-gritty details of how this kind of planetary societal realm can take one provisional step at a time and can be revised in 10 years. So the problem with obsoleteness of the previous architectural experiments were not only the problems of architecture, but was also the problems of the whole financial, political, societal directions. So I don't call them failed experiments. It was just that society decided to move to other directions. So in spatial terms, I mean, all of the projects are super rich, and I'm super excited to see what is the final outcome in again, this kind of planetary societal realm. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you, Manus.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Very nice. I really enjoyed a lot, and I'm curious to see how it will go further. And also, I think they are so provocative and open somehow that we could also go to, I don't know if you've seen this book that went out last year that is called The Empty Planet, because it's a provocative theory of some sociologists that say, what if all the women of the world at a certain point were such educated that they want to work, they want to get engaged with culture, and so they stop making so many kids, so it becomes that one kid's a family or even zero. So at a certain point, the population will drop super fast. So I think this is important too, not to take for granted that we will become 20 billion people on the earth. No, we have seen, I was reading the newspapers of November last year, and you should read the expectation. Completely wrong, because the premises changes, and they change in 2 or 3 months. So they said that this year it would be the year of empathy, the year of boom of economy. So what? 3 months after, the premises was completely different. So I think the power also of these projects is that they seem somehow, it's a word that goes everywhere now, it's like resilient, but that they can sort of being also anticipating, like satellites, understanding what is happening, and so they can tune their interaction with this relation with nature. So they can adapt to what is happening. Could be also the zero human planet.
Yeah, that is always the challenge, to be resilient while making an architectural proposal.
But very good, very nice jobs, and congratulations to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. So thanks the jurors that you left. Bye everybody. Thanks the student. Bye Philippe.
Thanks a lot.
Manos, Liz, Ingrid, Marco, and all our students, and the other who joined. Great. We had also some extra guests. It was good.
Okay, thank you.
Conversation.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.